The alley smelled like iron and oil, and the faint, sweet tang of cigarette smoke that never quite left the garage, even after they'd stopped. A single lamp over the roll-up door threw a pool of yellow that made the puddles on the concrete look like spilled moonlight. Pete stood there in that light, shoulders hunched, palms white around the strap of a small backpack. Behind him, Victoria hugged a comic book tight to her chest, the spine creased from being read more than once. Her sneakers were scuffed. Her hair fell in an untidy curtain around her face. She looked 10, exhausted, and very small. "It's not for me," Pete said, the words coming out in a rush that made them sound younger than he was. "I'm scared for her. Just one night, please." The sound hit the garage like a small blunt force. Inside hung tools caught and held the lamp's spill. A row of jackets on hooks swung faintly in the breeze. Men and women who had been bent over a rusted carburetor straightened. Ryan's shoulders went still. Jinx stopped polishing a chrome fender with a rag. Copper had a wrench frozen halfway between his hands and the engine he'd been tending. For a moment there was nothing but the tick of a cooling metal and the soft, inarticulate noise of a child breathing. Ryan walked the few steps to the door with the deliberate gait of someone who had seen a lot and judged little. His voice was low, the kind that belonged to the gravel in his throat, and the command of someone used to being the calm center in other people's storms. "Come in," he said. It wasn't a question. Pete moved aside, and Victoria slid past him as if she feared she might be left standing in that lamplit puddle. The garage swallowed them in warmth. The smell changed. Oil and metal gave way to yeast and sugar from where someone had a small pan in the oven. A cot sat against the far wall, already unfolded. On it, a folded blanket waited, neat and familiar. A kettle sang quietly on a hot plate. Someone, Wrench, Pete would find out later, had left a thermos of warm milk with a line of chocolate mixed in. Copper was there, sleeves rolled, pressing a mug into Pete's hands through a tremulous, almost invisible smile. "Take it slow," Jinx said, and knelt to Victoria's level as if small bodies came with an instruction manual. There was no prying, only the kind of attention that makes a person feel safe enough to breathe. Victoria hugged the comic tighter and looked up at Jinx with a guarded curiosity. "You like dragons?" Jinx asked, voice soft and immediate. Victoria's answer is almost a whisper. "Yeah." "Good. Dragons need sleep." Jinx's fingers worked to Victoria's hair like a practiced answer to a worried child, gentle, steady. He braided a strand into a small, neat plaid. The motion was ordinary and sacred at once, a small domestic ritual that measured care by minutes and knuckles rather than pronouncements. Pete watched. He had been awake for what felt like a lifetime.
He had wiped the sleep out of his sister's eyes. He had packed a backpack with a couple of shirts, a water bottle, and the comic. Items that felt absurdly trivial for what he'd asked for at the door. When Ryan put a rough, calloused hand on his shoulder, Pete flinched slightly, then let the weight be what it was. A permit to stop carrying everything alone. 2 hours, 1 watch, 1 cot, just until morning. Someone said it lightly, almost like a joke, but there was an undertow to the sentence. Nobody asked for proof or for money. They set a rotation that was more ritual than schedule. Ryan would take the first shift, then Diesel, then Kappa. The club's watch system was an old muscle memory. Whoever wasn't sleeping paced the garage, checked the locks, made coffee, and kept an eye on the streetlights. "Think fast. What would you do if someone knocked at your door asking for help? Tell us in the comments," Ryan said under his breath. And Pete felt a momentary ridiculousness at the intrusion. It was the sort of practical invitation the club treated questions with. No sermon, only an opening that let people decide how to feel and how to act. They offered immediate, small things that mattered. A blanket with a faint smell of cedar, a mug warmed in hands that knew how to measure comfort, a cot placed by the light where Victoria could be watched without feeling watched. Gloria, who lived a few houses down and who had been an unofficial godmother to half the neighborhood's kids for as long as anyone wanted to count, arrived just before dawn with a thermos of cinnamon rolls and a soft apron. Her presence quietly changed the room from a shelter to a home. She fussed at the curl of Victoria's hair, set the pastry down like a peace offering, and slid a small stack of picture books onto the cot. "You hungry, little one?" she asked, as if she hadn't learned every possible way to ask that question. Just one night, Pete kept repeating in his head like a prayer, his jaw unclenching a millimeter for every hour they let themselves be practical and mundane. The watch had patterns. Men sat on milk crates, hands busy cleaning parts or carting the deck. Someone put on a bad record, and the garage hummed. Victoria opened a book and let the comic fall to her lap. Her fingers touched the pages with a slow, careful reverence, as if she were relearning how to be entertained rather than vigilant. Night takes a long time when you are on the hook for someone else's safety. It is long in ways the night of an adult who can call a landlord or a hotline isn't. Pete's pace matched the work. Tighten a bolt for distraction, check the window, braid a strand of hair for a sister who liked dragons. Sleep came in stutters. Once an hour of tenacious, exhausted rest, other times a sleep that felt like a short break in preparation for the next moment of alertness. Jinx sat with Victoria on a milk crate-journed low chair and did a quiet, methodical check.
He had worked in shelters before, had done training that taught him how to look for the signs a child couldn't or wouldn't explain. He kept his questions small and the conversation about things children could still own: favorite foods, the color of dragons, whether the comic's hero had a name. When he glanced up, his face did not change like someone who had been surprised by what he'd seen. Instead, it compassed the room with a particular care. "Pete," Jinx said gently, drawing the boy aside so Victoria could keep a safe distance from adult urgency. "Can you tell me about her arm?" Pete tightened around the question, because to vocalize it felt like breaking a seal. "She fell off her bike," he said, the words wooden and practiced, like an explanation he'd given to himself a dozen times. He did not look at Victoria as he said it. Jinx didn't press the lie. He had the quiet skill to let a child decide whether to tell. He only said, "When you feel ready, you tell. No rush." That one line told Pete without accusation that the room would hold whatever he offered. But the bruise on Victoria's upper arm wasn't something a bike fall left. It had a shape and a faded pattern that read differently. Jinx's training taught him the art of observation. He asked Victoria to draw a dragon on a scrap of paper, then watched the way she held the pencil, how her fingers curled as if to protect the stroke. Conversation with a child is often quieter than an inspection. Jinx read the hesitance in the drawn scales, and the way Victoria left one limb of the dragon unfinished. "This changes what we call one night," Copper said later in low tones, folding the observation into practical next steps. They were not bluster or bravado. Copper's voice was the voice that makes phone calls and tracks people down through networks. He knew who to reach and how quickly. He called Melanie, an advocate and lawyer who had a reputation for moving the pieces when the pieces mattered. While he spoke, the garage became a command center in the most domestic way. Someone found scissors, someone set out a pen, someone cleared a bit of table for paper. They did what they could with the competence born from needing to do what had to be done rather than waiting for the perfect plan. After a brief, careful conversation with Copper, Melanie agreed to come by. She arrived with a folder of forms and a steady, capable face made smaller by the compassion that made her good at the job. "We can file for emergency custody," she said to Pete without theatricality, sitting at the table like she was there to add clarity rather than make promises. "The threshold is danger. We have to show credible risk. We'll need a statement, your account, and we'll involve CPS. We'll do the paperwork tonight if you're up to it." "We're not looking for kids to leave," Ryan said, and the line was not defensive.
He meant it in the way one means a promise. The club would not abandon them to some unknown future without an attempt at keeping them together. "We'll help find somewhere safe that's right for her." His hand brushed Pete's shoulder again, that weight of permission. Pete exhaled and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Melanie worked through the night with the efficiency of someone who understood systems. She translated Pete's urgency into legible, legal motion. The paperwork made danger tangible: dates, times, conditions. It turned the frantic into the plausible. Within the first morning, Melanie had filed the emergency custody request with the county, an action that would trigger a CPS response and the start of a process that could lead to a temporary placement decision within the coming days. It was not a finality. It was an important hinge towards safety. Sandra, the CPS worker assigned to the case, arrived later that morning. She had the kind of presence that didn't fill the room with authority, but instead shifted the air toward a professional quiet. She smiled at Victoria with measured warmth and sat at a respectful distance. She didn't ask the heavy questions right away. She sat on a toolbox and let Victoria lead. "Do you like dragons?" she asked, mirroring Jinx's earlier tactic. Victoria nodded. She drew a dragon on a sheet of junk mail with a pencil the size of a grown-up's, and then, in a move that made Sandra soft, started to color the dragon's wings with the blunt end of a crayon. Sandra watched quietly, taking in the small movements. How the child held the pencil, how her knee bounced slightly when she was anxious, the way she offered the drawing to show who she was when not being asked to tell why she needed help. The assessment was child-centered in every official and human way. Sandra asked the questions Victoria could answer in her own terms. She observed the environment, how Victoria slept on the cot, whether adults respected the child's space, whether she appeared hungry or cold, whether she had access to comfort items. She spoke to Pete too, privately, giving him space to describe what had happened and how scared he'd been. There were no promises whispered on the bench in the garage. There were careful, realistic acknowledgments. "We can get her immediate safety. Temporary placement can be arranged. We will file an assessment and recommend emergency placement if the danger is credible." Copper had already made a reconnaissance ride to the trailer that had been their home until a man named Dean had moved in. He came back with details: missing locks, a door that didn't latch right, the smell of neglect. He didn't deliver these as theater. He handed the facts over like a dossier. Melanie and Sandra made the next moves together, a dance between legal procedure and child welfare practice.
Melanie explained that an emergency custody order could be fast, that within 72 hours certain decisions could be made regarding temporary care, but that follow-up investigations would define longer-term strategy. Sandra's notebook filled with observations and dates. Gloria had been an immediate candidate. She had the kind of house that smelled like cinnamon and laundry and consequence-free hugs. She had, in quiet ways, been serving as an informal safety net for kids in the neighborhood for years. When Melanie suggested Gloria and asked if she would be willing to be an emergency placement, Gloria didn't blink. "Of course," she said simply. "Kids need space to be kids. We make a meal, we make a bed, we make a plan." The club did not make the legal decisions. They were connectors. They sat in the public parts of the process with the measured relief of people who had helped push the door open for a system to step in. They watched as Melanie filed the paperwork, as Sandra signed forms that would allow for a temporary custody order to be considered. There was a tension that accompanied the legal process, the recognition that this was not the same as a promise of forever, but it was a procedural tension rather than a despairing one. The law moved slowly by design, but there were levers for immediate safety when a credible danger presented itself. When the paperwork was in and the assessment read aloud in measured official voices, Sandra recommended emergency temporary placement with Gloria. It was a careful sentence that aimed to keep the child's dignity intact, a 90-day plan that would give space for a full investigation, for the county to assess housing, and for the family to be involved in formal interviews. Pete listened to the words and felt a curious thing, an easing, like letting a strained rope find a loop to rest in. It was not the end of anything, but it was a significant reprieve. He was not giving Victoria away. He was allowing a system and a community to wrap around them both. That afternoon, the garage shifted into a small private celebration that was more about reclaiming small joys than signaling victory. A grill was fired up on the patio. Someone had scored a jar of patties and cans of cola, and Gloria badgered the kids into washing hands. Victoria learned to shuffle carts, clumsy and joyful, and let out a laugh that sounded almost unfamiliar. The sound made a few of the men in the garage look at each other and not say anything else. They did not need to. They baked cinnamon rolls that morning. The recipe Gloria used was simple, a soft, travel-worn thing that smelled like a promise. The rolls rose in the oven and were doled out warm with fingers that were not sterile, but that had a willingness to be used for good.
There were small, deliberate acts. A braid finished with a cheap rubber band that meant the world. A mug pressed into sticky hands. A flashlight passed to Pete with a look that said, "Without questions, we'll watch." In the legal liminal space, decisions were made with support. Melanie stayed close, calling county offices, clarifying procedural steps. She explained to Pete what to expect next: interviews, a home visit, the timeline for the 90-day temporary plan. "They'll talk to you, to Victoria, to Gloria, to the club," she said. "They'll document the conditions in the trailer, and they'll decide what is necessary for safety. It's not about blame as much as it is about protection right now." Pete listened, the world inside his chest a braced thing. He had been the one who knocked at midnight and carried the small body across cold concrete. He had been the one who counted breaths in the dark. Now he found himself being handed instructions on what to do for next steps, practical, manageable tasks. It kept him working, a useful distraction that let him process the relief without being overwhelmed by it. Melanie's files were precise. She filed the emergency custody petition describing the immediate risk and the club's temporary measures. Sandra completed her assessment, noting the child's demeanor, the visible signs of trauma in soft clinical terms. Faded bruising observed on upper arm, child demonstrates hypervigilance, reports of constrained movement and fear of certain individuals. The language was careful and non-sensational. These notes would be used by the court to make decisions that were as humane as they were legal. When formal papers were signed, Pete felt a surreal weight lift from him. The things that had been floating as terrifying possibilities found names and forms. Melanie explained the limitations. This order only stands for the period necessary to ensure immediate protection and to conduct a full investigation. It gives you and her time to breathe, to not be in immediate danger. It does not decide the permanent outcome. "Sometimes," Ryan said that night, with a rare softness for a man who rarely used that tone, "protection looks like other people holding the fort while you sleep. That's okay." Pete let the idea in, like a small, fragile truth. Protection was a job shared, a set of hands that lifted together. The following days were full of practical, mundane, and healing smallness. Gloria's home had a backyard with a swing that squeaked and a chain-link fence that kept out danger as much as it kept the world in sight. Victoria refused to sleep without the comic beside her. Gloria laid it on the nightstand with a practiced tenderness, turning the corner of the page as if to keep the story ready for a sleepy dawn. Pete found chores to do that let him feel useful.
carrying a sack of flour for a batch of pancakes, sweeping, organizing a small pile of donated clothes and toys.
The acts were ordinary, but they stitched things back into place. Conversations moved at a pace that made sense for children and for adults bearing the care of others. Sandra conducted follow-up visits and interviews, always making space for Victoria to lead the encounter. She used a child-centered approach, letting Victoria choose a pencil color to draw with, saying, "Tell me about your favorite part," instead of, "Tell me what happened." It is in these small protocol choices that dignity is preserved, where a child is given ownership over her story, rather than having it extruded for someone else's paperwork. Gloria, ever the mother, not only to her own kids but to a scatter of neighborhood children, took to making breakfast that looked and smelled like warmth. She taught Victoria the trick for flipping pancakes without breaking them, and the child laughed loud enough that the sound snagged on people's hearts. Pete saw a side of his sister he'd been starving for, an ordinary sibling who teased and sulked and argued about card games. He let himself be pulled into those micro-rituals with a hesitant hand that gradually became firmer. There were procedural days where the mood grew thin with officialness. Interviews, calls, forms, timelines. Melanie guided Pete through statements, explaining legal terminology in words that didn't make the bottom drop out of the world. "We don't need to relive anything you can't handle," she said quietly. "Just tell me what you remember and what scared you." He told her what he could, and she translated it into a credible narrative the court could hold. Meanwhile, the club kept ritual and watch. They installed a fresh deadbolt on the trailer door, so that if the shelter at Gloria's couldn't be permanent, at least the record would show an attempt to stabilize the living conditions. They didn't confront Dean. They didn't take justice into their own hands. They documented and called authorities when required. Their role was not to punish, but to protect. When the county court reviewed the emergency custody petition and Sandra's assessment, the recommendation for temporary placement with Gloria was formalized in an order that gave them a 90-day time window for deeper investigation and potential family reunification steps if conditions allowed. The order was careful and conditional, preserving both the child's immediate need for safety and the legal scaffolding required for subsequent decisions. For Pete, it felt miraculous in a small administrative way, an official recognition that his fear had been grounded in reality and that a plan now existed to make room for something safer. The safety did not erase the past. It simply made space from it. Pete and Victoria were never promised a forever. All around them, people spoke and acted within capacities. The club offered supervision and community. Gloria offered household stability. Melanie offered legal navigation. Sandra offered casework and assessment.
Each person performed a function, and together they formed a network that held the siblings the first time they could not hold each other alone. There were micro-rituals that felt salvific. They had a night where they all ate burgers. Small things like this became reclaimed childhood. Pete shuffled cards and tripped over a rule, and Victoria delighted in his mistake like any unimpressed little sister. Diesel taught Victoria how to fold paper planes, and Gloria clapped with the kind of pride that meant she had named the child's small victories. These were not cures, they were stitches. Even people who were skeptical of the club's tattoos and leather and noisy motorcycles found themselves with softened faces when kids laughed. The garage slowly became a place of stitches rather than scars. Ryan stood a little straighter when Victoria sang along to a recorded song with the misremembered lyrics children make their own. Jinx sat beside her with a stack of small paperbacks, choosing stories that were brave but not heavy, offering Victoria a chance to be a reader and not a patient in a story. Pete allowed himself a small, unprecedented indulgence. He slept in a bed with a pillow rather than a garage cot for the first time since they'd fled. He dreamt briefly of the trailer door closed and safe, of ordinary arguments about homework and sunsets, and woke with a wetness in his eyes that he couldn't label. The relief was not clean, but it was real. He could feel the coiling tension in his shoulders loosened by incremental degrees. As the case progressed, the club kept its promises. They supplied transportation when Melanie or Sandra needed to reach the trailer for inspections. They made sure Gloria had whatever small resources she needed for the child to be comfortable: sheets, a second pillow, a small lamp. Their competence was not sentimental. It was built from a lifetime of fixing things with their hands and fixing what they couldn't with the law by being present. A small victory came when Victoria learned to shuffle cards properly. It was meaningless in a grand sense, but monumental in a child's one: mastery of a simple manual skill. She sat at the table,
tongue peeking as concentration tightened her lips, and the deck clattered into a neat, unintended, perfect riffle. She laughed so hard she had to clap her mouth with one hand. Pete, watching, felt an ache that was somehow braided with thanksgiving. The ordinary joy looked like armor to him. The community watched the process like a quiet, imperfect chorus. People donated clothes and toys. A neighbor left an envelope with a gift card and a note that said, "Keep going." The garage hummed with the labor of people who believed protecting a child shouldn't require a medal, only willingness. They were, in the end, a found family, non-judgmental, prepared to do what was necessary, but not perform it for headlines. Formal meetings took place.
Melanie insisted on documenting witness statements and gathering evidence of unsafe conditions without theatrics. She had a clear respect for how sensitive such cases are. "The child's voice matters most," she told the club at one meeting. "We gather facts to protect her, that's all. We don't weaponize pain." The club respected that line. They gave their statements, they provided photos of the trailer's broken latch, records of the midnight arrival, names of witnesses to the child's state, and a coherent account of how they had acted to help. When the 90-day plan was formalized, it was not a decree, but a period allocated for thorough engagement, housing assessments, interviews, potential family services if reunification was safe and possible, and the child's needs at the center. The order also included an agreement that the club would be available as support persons and that Gloria would host visits. There was a process laid out: periodic reviews, a caseworker assigned, and an explicit note that legal counsel would represent the child's best interests if needed. The arc that began at midnight had threaded through several systems: street-level compassion, legal advocacy, child welfare, and domestic warmth. They had not invented a perfect solution. They had, through practical steps and a network of people, moved a child from immediate danger into a monitored, safe sanctuary. It was the best anyone could ask for someone who had been living at the edge. In the kitchen at Gloria's, Victoria learned to make a simple sandwich that had, by the time of her 9th day there, become a ritual. She spread peanut butter with solemn precision. "Don't drown it," Gloria teased, and Victoria stuck out her tongue in a mimicry that made everyone around the counter chuckle. Pete sat on the floor, surrounded by a mess of donated books and ripped pages, and let the laughter reach him. He let himself be ordinary in that room, teased about card dealing, pressed into washing dishes as punishment for a lost game, told off for leaving the light on. The small ordinariness of life became a way of counting progress. There were quiet, frank moments where the weight of what had happened pressed in. Pete sat with Melanie in the garage one afternoon, hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug. "I'm scared it could happen again," he admitted, in a small voice that had nothing performative about it. Melanie didn't offer a silver bullet pep talk. She offered facts and process and a steady look. "We will make plans that reduce the risk," she said. "We will put supports in place. What happened will be investigated. You and Victoria will have voices in that process. You don't have to carry it alone." "How do I stop being scared?" Pete asked, and the question was simple. It was the one that sealed the night for him. "You remember the braid?" Gloria said from the doorway, arms crossed, the image of practical kindness. "It takes 2 hands. You don't have to braid alone."
It was not a counter-narrative that promised perfect absence of fear. It was a truth about shared labor. Pete realized the braid was a metaphor, but also an instruction. People would help hold one end and the other. He could rest his hands for a while. By the time the next legal review came, the home conditions at the trailer had been documented, and inspectors had found the kinds of neglect and instability that supported Sandra's original recommendation. The county continued investigations into Dean's actions through appropriate legal channels. The club did not take up arms. They reported and recorded, and let the law do its work in its own time. The small celebrations kept returning: a card game night, an impromptu picnic in Gloria's backyard, a Saturday morning where everyone brought a board game and traded moves. These things did not erase a child's trauma. They did, however, create new memories with different weight. A child can relearn to laugh in places where laughter had been dangerous. They can taste a cinnamon roll and not watch the door at the same time. In the quiet moments, Pete walked the perimeter of Gloria's yard, hands in his pockets, feeling the echo of the midnight concrete under his soles in his memory. He had been the one to knock on the garage's lit door. That memory sat with him neither as a badge nor as a wound, but as evidence that he had done what he had to. He let the thought uncoil without feeling that he had to carry the rest.
Victoria slept that night with a comic on her chest and a book with dragons on the shelf beside her bed. Her breathing was even. A small backsplash of moonlight came through the thin curtains. Pete sat in a chair by the window and let his eyes close for a while. When he woke, it was not to the spike of adrenaline, but to a slow, available awareness. The kind that allows a person to be present to the day, rather than on constant alert. For the first time in a long stretch, he allowed himself to be tired on purpose, rather than from fear. The garage repairs continued as if nothing of consequence had happened, and yet everything of consequence had. Diesel tuned an engine with precision, and the sound was oddly comforting, the measured hum of order. Everyone on the team continued to do what they did best: repair, prepare, be available. Their tattoos and bikes became less of a statement and more of a backdrop to the work of community building. At a modest evening gathering to mark the start of the 90-day arrangement, people sat around a table laden with burgers and fries, and someone put on music that everyone seemed to know the chorus to. It was not a party as much as it was a shared breath. Victoria learned a victory dance that involved hopping and clapping until Pete could not help but join. Laughter knit the edges of the night together. In an unguarded exchange near the end of the evening, Pete took Gloria aside.
He wanted to say thank you, and something stronger, an apology for being the one who had to cause all the trouble, but his words didn't come out as planned. "You keep her safe," he offered instead, which is perhaps the most ordinary and meaningful sentence a brother could give. Gloria's smile softened. "So do you," she said. "You did what you had to." The presence of professionals never waned. Sandra continued her checks, visiting with the necessary balance of friendliness and formality. Melanie kept contact, filing and clarifying, explaining that the 90 days were meant to give everyone space to do necessary work, investigating the structure of the family, testing the safety of any potential reunification, providing parent support services if feasible, and ensuring Victoria's immediate well-being was never at risk. The legal machinery was mundane in its bureaucracy, but life-saving in its effects. Forms, ordered home visits, documented interviews that would form a trail of evidence. The club's role remained hands-on, connectors, guardians, people who did not let the edges of the system carry the whole burden. In the small hours before dawn on the last of the first week, Pete stepped out to smoke a cigarette with a friend. He did not inhale much. Smoke was more a talisman for adult company than a habit. He looked down at the yard and saw Victoria on the swing, her legs kicking skyward with the easy balance of someone who trusted the rope and the person behind it. He felt something in his chest that might have been relief or gratitude or a newly learned permission to be less vigilant. He had been the one who knocked. He had become the one who could also let others hold the night. If there was a lesson learned that was neither tidy nor triumphant, it was this: protection was a shared craft. It required small, mundane kindnesses, blankets, braided hair, cinnamon rolls, and the sober, procedural steps of a system designed to hold children when their home was not safe. It required people with the capacity to act without making themselves the story's hero. It required professionals who could say, "This is what we can do now," and a community that would follow through with the things on the list. And most of all, it required that someone believe the plea in the dark, not to sensationalize it, but to respond. A teen's urgent knock at midnight had been answered, not in headline-making heroism, but in ordinary, sustained care. For Pete and Victoria, that answer had meant a cot, a braid, a warm mug, a lawyer's brief, a CPS assessment, a temporary home with a woman who made pancakes and put dragon stories on the shelf. The night the garage door closed behind the caseworker and the club settled into their rhythm once more, Pete sat beside Victoria while she finished a picture book. Her eyes fluttered closed with the comfortable weight of safety. The comic lay face down on the blanket.
Pete's hands rested in his lap instead of being clenched at the ends of a rope. He let himself feel the release in small increments, a loosening of his jaw, a softer breath. "Thank you," he whispered, to no one in particular, and to everyone who had answered the door. He did not know what the future held, and neither did anyone else. The legal process would unfold in its slow, necessary way. Investigations would continue. But for now, there was a small, honest peace, a found family that kept watch, professionals who were doing their job, and a child allowed to sleep without counting the dangers outside.
If this story leaves a question at your doorstep, it's a simple one. What would you do if someone knocked on your door in the middle of the night asking for help? Would you answer? Would you bring a blanket, a mug, and a rota of people ready to stay awake? Could your community be the kind of place that stitches a safety net together? If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more true feel dramas of community and rescue.